How are you doing? This is our third unit of online learning. We have one more after this, and that one's going to be a small group unit with a project. I am releasing the May calendar with this unit, so make sure you check that out. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we would have done in class if we were doing this lesson in class. I would have put little notes on your backs, and they would have had conditions like 8 feet tall person, a person in a wheelchair, a person in a same-sex couple. And I would ask you to go around the room not knowing what kind of person is in your body, on your back, and treat that person as if you would be interacting with that person in real life. For instance, do you offer to help people who are in wheelchairs more than maybe they want to be helped? Do you offer to help them with their groceries and things like that when maybe they don't want to? And so we'd have a discussion about what it means to speak across cultural lines. Because as we know, every time we open our mouths, even if we are interacting with a twin of your own, you could still be interacting across cultural lines, because where culture resides is in the brains of the people who use it. So when we think about what culture is, it's the beliefs, attitudes, and values shared by a group of people, and behaviors also. But behaviors generally stem from our values, or sometimes stem from our values. Sometimes we're just following cultural norms, right? But sometimes behaviors stem from what we think is right and wrong. And so when we look at the chapter in the book that has to do with culture, it looks at diversity. And the way I would define diversity is the celebration of differences. Now, I know that the true definition just means differences. And the reason why we believe that diversity is good, and the reason why I will be selecting your groups for the group project, is that I'm just going to randomly put people together. Generally, if I would be in class and I would say select the group that you'd like to work with, you would probably pick people who view the world similarly to you. Maybe you'd pick people that you've had conversations with. Maybe you'd pick people that you went to high school with, because sometimes we find comfort in that, but generally there's not necessarily growth in that or a good interchange because we have a difference of perspective. So, I will be just assigning random groups. And the reason that we want diversity in groups is because, think about it, working in groups is hard to schedule. It is almost easier to get work done on your own. However, we believe that by having diverse work groups, we get better, more creative results. If you picked your groups and they were people that approach the world just like you did, then you'd probably get the same result that you would get in working alone. But when you work with people who approach the world differently than you, hopefully you get a different worldview. So we're going to use the word GRAPES as an acronym for ways that we are different. So if you think about it, G, you'd probably guess it's gender. And we used to think of gender in a biological fashion as male and female, but we know now that there's many other ways to define gender. And that there are ways that we enculturate boys differently than girls, even in 2020. And when Meghan Markle said that they were going to raise their son in an androgynous way, and that was an interesting perspective, because it's hard to do that. I mean, right from the get-go, people want to buy you gifts that go down gender lines, and they want to get boys trucks and girls dolls. And so it's hard to undo that norm that has been around for a while. But when we speak across gender lines, I think it's important that we do that with politically correct language. And we've tried to forever, I would say, your spouse. And for many years of my teaching, spouse was a limited term because it wasn't applicable to same-sex couples. Now that has changed, and it is. But in that interim, I think a more inclusive term was partner. So I tried to do that in my lectures, even though I speak from a heterosexual bias. And this really goes with the S on grapes. I think it's also relevant when we talk about gender. So the R has to do with race and religion, and it can, I'm just using this. This can be just a variety of differences in people. But the difference between race and ethnicity, which is going to be our E, is that race has to do with physical differences in people, color of skin, texture of hair, and things like that. So that it doesn't necessarily, and I think I just got cut off from this, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with any behavioral practices. That is more the ethnic divisions between people. So you could adopt someone from China and raise that person as an American, and their race would be Asian and their ethnicity would be American. So that is, that is something that could definitely be a reality. Um, then we go to age, and age. This was a really interesting one this year because I turned 50, and I've always felt young, and I always have thought, what did I consider old? And old seemed older than what I was. But 50 sounds a little bit old. When you start getting invitations to join ARP and things like that, you start thinking about, yeah, maybe I am old. And then you hear that maybe you're at an increased risk for certain things when you're at this age level, and you think, man, I must be old. But I mean, I bet some of you have had thoughts that there was discrimination for being young. For instance, you couldn't rent a car, you might not be able to rent a hotel, you can't drink until you're 21. And those are usually some good persuasive speech topics. So, and I think you can build a case for some of those things, because I don't know that I think age is more than a number. I think there are very mature people who are young, and I think there are really immature people who are old. So I think that age is just a number. I try to live that way. But we know that we are a culture that doesn't necessarily revere wisdom and age, and that we have a lot of products to make us look younger, especially women. If you go back to gender, there's a whole lot more makeup products to make a woman look older, but a man, as he ages, can just look chiseled and refined, but women just look old. And look at your anchor people if you want proof of that. They get tucked and Botoxed, injected, and the men just get distinguished wrinkles. But that's not pretty if you are a woman. So age, that's age. And I think sometimes we encounter a lot of ageism when people think that we are too expensive when we age. I remember having an exchange student in my hometown, Vandalia, and we drove by a nursing home. And this person from Finland said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, that's a nursing home." "What do you do there?" And I said, "Well, that's where you go when you're old and you need assistance in daily tasks." And she goes, "We don't have those." And I said, "Really? What do you do?" And she goes, "Well, we bring them in our homes. Like, we live multi-generationally." And in this COVID epidemic, that we have been encouraged to get people out of nursing home situations if you can, because they are dangerous and breeding grounds for illness and things like that. But that's not necessarily a typical thing for our culture. Like, we're pretty quick to get the new and improved version of things and people and job candidates and things like that. P has to do with physical ability, personality. You could make a case for any of those. You think of life being accessible until you are pushing a stroller, or you're in a wheelchair or using crutches for a period of time, and you realize that things aren't as accessible as you thought. And even places that claim that they meet the American with Disabilities Act guidelines, that elevator can be tucked half a mile away. It's on this floor, so we met the criteria, but it's not convenient. So I think about that. There are a whole lot of things, though, topics of using support animals, and how you should treat support animals who are there to do a job for someone who needs them. There's a whole lot of things, interesting things, when you delve into the rights and the communication that you should have with people who have special needs. Remember, you put the people first. Ethnicity, I already said that. Ethnicity deals with customs and practices, and it's interesting that DNA testing and 23andMe and things like that have allowed people to explore their ethnicities for the first time, perhaps, and maybe have learned some things that they weren't who they thought they were. Um, what do you do to preserve yours? I have to think about that. I don't do a whole lot. I think I'm German, and I don't do anything because of that, about that. I hope that you know more about your ethnic origins than I do. And then economic orientation, economic status could be the E as well. And you think about America being the land of opportunity. And, um, and is it, do you feel like in the United States that everyone can get an education? Now they may have the debt afterwards, but do you feel like it's accessible? Do you feel like you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make yourself anything, that we all have opportunities? Could we all run for president? There's some interesting economic questions and I think that that landscape is changing. I think that wealth has been lost in as oil prices have plummeted and things like that. So this is going to be a really interesting territory. Um, I often think about all these stimulus packages, and I think about the generations like many of you who are going to be stuck paying some of those tabs of this money that we've freely given out. Yeah, and I think we should give it out. I don't know the solution, but that's a whole lot to think about. And the S has to do with sexual orientation, and we know now that that is, for the first time ever, everyone can marry. And but I've had students say that regardless of that, that was before that happened, that they still felt that of all these parts of diversity, that was the one that we still needed the most work with. So as a generation, I think that we're getting there, but that um, it's important that we have these conversations where we can be open and honest. And I think prejudice is based on ignorance, and we have communication skills and a willingness to have these risky conversations. We can learn more uh, about different cultural groups. And I think that's how we grow. And that's why your discussion question this unit is to explore some of those things that make us different, and what we've learned by interacting with people who've had different upbringings, who are in different groups, and who may view the world differently than you do. I think that's how we make better decisions, when we include those voices and when everyone is welcome at the table. So I challenge you to read the unit. I challenge you to think deeply about your heritage and about how you welcome those who may be different than you. And one last thing, when we think about cultural change and we think about things that have taken a while, I remember when people had to cover all tattoos for most every job, and you've seen some loosening of that. And people wonder, why does that take so long? Well, cultural change takes time because, remember, culture resides in the brains of people. It's not something that we put on outwardly. It resides here in what we think of as acceptable and normal. And so if we're wanting a change, we have to change what's in here. All right? Think about that as change agents, people, trailblazers. I miss you. Bye.